Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this special lunchtime discussion on good data, bad data, organised by the Data Ethics and Governance section of the Royal Statistical Society. My name is Brian Tarran. I'm the editor of Significance magazine, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today three great speakers. So we have first up Sam Gilbert, who's an affiliated researcher at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, and a former employee number one and chief marketing officer at the fintech company bought by many. And Sam's here to talk us through the key arguments of his, I think, a really thought-provoking and sort of challenging book, Good Data, An Optimist's Guide to Our Digital Future. So in a moment, I'll ask Sam to give us a short presentation, and then we'll follow that up with two discussants. So we have Kenneth Cukier, the Deputy Executive Editor of The Economist and the co-author of the book Big Data, which is a New York Times bestseller. And Ken's latest book is Framers, on the Power of Mental Models and the Limitations of Data. And we also have Rima Patel, who is Head of Deliberative Engagement at Ipsos Mori and a former Associate Director at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So after the talks, we plan to have plenty of time for some audience questions. So keep that in mind when you're listening to the speakers. Please do keep cameras and microphones off while our speakers are presenting. And as a little reminder, we're recording this event, and we'd like to make it available on the RSS YouTube channel. So if you do ask a question or you make another contribution that you would like us to erase from the final recording, you can find a contact email address in the chat. If you email Luth, our colleague at RSS, we'll be able to arrange for that to be edited out. So now I'll hand over to Sam, who's going to explain, why we need to rethink what I guess you could describe as the all too common sort of pessimistic take on the power of Facebook, and why the fear of surveillance capitalism kind of risks distracting us all from the positive things we can achieve if we put more rather than less data into the public domain. So over to you, Sam.
Brian, thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks also very much to Paul for suggesting this event, and to all of you for coming today. So I'm going to try and talk now for no more than about 15 minutes, and in that time try and give you a whistle-stop tour of the main arguments of my book, Good Data. But I thought I should start by saying something about what motivated me to write the book in the first place. And I guess really what that boils down to is the fact that for the last 4 or 5 years, the public conversation that we've been having about data and about digital technology has kind of been dominated by risks. So sometimes that's risks to individuals' privacy rights, and sometimes it might be the risks of biases being embedded in algorithmic decision-making. Now, I think these are really important issues, but the concern that I had was that we might be in danger of losing sight of some of the positive benefits that data and data science can bring to society. And so it was those positive benefits that I wanted to rediscover with the book. So what are its main arguments? I think there are three. So first of all, that data-driven ads are actually quite a good business model for the web. And secondly, as Brian alluded to just then, that we will maximize the public good if we put more data rather than less data into the public domain. And then thirdly, the idea that digital power is not actually defined by how concentrated it is, but by how distributed it is. So let's get into the first one of those, which probably seems a little bit counterintuitive, the idea that data-driven advertising might actually be a good business model for the web. And I suppose part of the reason that might seem counterintuitive is that since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there's been an awful lot of concern about the data-driven targeting of ads through platforms like Facebook. And I think the presumption of the critics of this business model, including people like Shoshana Zuboff, is that the algorithms that big tech companies have are now so sophisticated that they know you better than you know yourself. And that as a function of that, we've got a fundamental threat to human freedom and to democracy because people can be manipulated. And I suppose that the archetype of surveillance capitalism is that image you can see on the screen from the film by Netflix, The Social Dilemma, where a user of social media gets directly and deliberately coerced in ways that are serving the interests of big tech companies. But what I argue in the book is that actually the idea that manipulation is what's happening when we use digital technology is just factually not correct. And part of my reason for thinking that is that the origin of these techniques that Facebook ads and Google ads and other digital targeting systems use is really quite old and really quite banal. So it's based on a technique from the 1980s called geodemographics that was invented at companies like Experian, where I used to work. And its purpose was to allow the expansion of catalog retail. And it did that by putting together data from public sources like the electoral roll with consumer survey data in order that data companies and retailers could better understand what people wanted to buy based on their postcode. So it's really based on the old saying, birds of a feather flock together. And I think when we think about data-driven targeting now, we have a bit of a tendency to assume that tech companies are developing databases of like comprehensive databases on every individual in the world. But actually, this isn't really how these systems work. They're much better understood as tools for helping make probabilistic inferences about the sort of things people want to buy. And these targeting systems that Facebook and Google and other actors in the space use are not essentially different from 1980s geodemographics. It's just that rather than using survey data, they're using behavioral and profile data that people produce as they live their lives online. And another sort of important difference is they've become more sophisticated because of advances in machine learning technology, but they are still fundamentally systems for making guesses about consumer preferences. They're not systems for controlling behavior. And they also bring some economic benefits. So because one of the features of data-driven targeting is that it allows businesses to become viable and scalable that wouldn't exist if the only way that we could promote products was through expensive channels like press and TV. So they move us away from a world that's dominated by players who have massive economies of scale towards a world that Chris Anderson described as the long tail, where there's this proliferation of products and services and causes that are discoverable in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have been. So there's also one final feature of data-driven advertising as a business model for the web that I wanted to touch on. And this is in response to a solution, a policy solution people often put forward, which is that we could just be paying cash for social media and for search. But I think when you think through that idea, you find yourself looking at one of these, or revealing one of these hidden benefits of targeted ads as a business model for the web. So what's on the screen right now is an analysis of Facebook's financial results from 2018 split by region. And one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that Facebook provides, or Meta I should say now, provides the same set of services to everybody around the world. And yet the value of the attention and the clicks of people who use Facebook varies enormously based on where they live. And that has this very interesting effect, which is that users of Facebook in more affluent regions like North America and Europe end up subsidizing the provision of services to users in Africa and Asia and Latin America and in other parts of the world. And that redistribution of value is worth something like $25 billion a year. So let's move on to the second argument of the book, which is that we should put more data rather than less data into the public domain. And I guess there's multiple cases that I could use to bring this to life. I could talk about the open data movement. I could talk about open banking. I could talk about the work that Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights group at Harvard have done using tax record data to address problems of economic inequality. But my favorite example is search data. So this is the data that is generated when we use Google and Bing and other search engines. And this, as you can see this quote from Sophie Coley on the slide. This is incredibly revealing data about what is on the minds of people. So Sophie says, every day we tell Google things we might not tell our partners, our friends, our family, or even our doctor. So when you aggregate and de-identify this data, it can lead to some fascinating insights into how people think. So this is very powerful in a commercial context. One example here from Screwfix, which I learned about when I was at Experian. Screwfix worked with a data science business called Chiasm to look at the differences between Screwfix's own mental models of their products and how customers thought about them as revealed by search data. So some of Screwfix's products from that analysis are on the screen. In the top left is a product that Screwfix called an outdoor light, but I, and it turns out many other people, would call that a security light. Underneath it, the yellow drill-looking product there, Screwfix called that a nailer, but literally 20 times as many people, according to search data, call that a nail gun. And then the top right, you've got these spot bulbs. The search data revealed that many people search for things like kitchen lighting. So they search for lighting by room type. But Screwfix, prior to looking at that data, had thought that lights can appear in any room, so there's no logic to categorizing them by room. But by aligning the way that they described their product better to the way that their customers thought about them, Screwfix was able to drive literally 5 times the amount of traffic to their website. So before we started Bought by Many, the fintech business that Brian mentioned in the introduction, I was a bit obsessed with this example, and I thought, well, maybe if this works for DIY retail, this same approach of using search data will also work in the context of insurance, which was what we wanted to focus on. So with the help of this data science company, Chiasm, I built a big database of tens of millions of rows of search data about insurance and started mining it for the best opportunity in the whole of the insurance market. And it turned out that opportunity was Pug Insurance. So this was pretty surprising, but actually there were some very good reasons why people were searching for Pug Insurance and not finding it. So pugs were really popular at the time, and they were also being stolen quite a lot, but insurance policies would not pay out for the full cost of replacing a pug that had been stolen. They also had things like breed-specific exclusions for conditions like hip dysplasia that pugs were particularly prone to. So the takeaway was that insurance products were not at all aligned to the needs that pug owners really had. And that was the insight from which we built Bought by Many as a company. And it now insures more than 500,000 pets in the UK, Sweden, and North America. But actually, I think the most exciting and socially useful applications of search data are not in the commercial realm. They're in places like public health. So over the last 10 years, a new discipline called infodemiology has been developed, where researchers apply internet search data to public health challenges. So this has been done effectively to provide useful insights into Zika, into Ebola, into West Nile virus, into mental health and suicide prevention. But then during the COVID pandemic, it has really come of age as a source of public value. So what you've got on the screen there is a capture from a paper published by Bill Lampos at University College London and his team. They built a predictive model using symptom searches relating to COVID, and they're actually able to track new outbreaks 17 days in advance of conventional forms of epidemiological surveillance. So hugely exciting and socially useful application of this data. So I'm conscious of time, so just quite quickly talk about the third main argument of the book, which is that digital power is actually more distributed than it is concentrated. So typically when people try and explain the power relations that we now live with when it comes to tech companies, the metaphor they reach for is Jeremy Bentham or Michel Foucault's vision of the panopticon. And so the idea there is that we as users of digital tech are in the position of prisoners in the panopticon, while the tech companies and their advertiser clients are in the position of the prison inspectors. So as Stephen Luke says, it's an image of monolithic unidirectional control. But I actually think the metaphor is rather misleading, because one of the most characteristic factors of digital power, in my opinion, is how distributed it is. So if we think back 10 years to the events of the Arab Spring and to many other cases where this digital power has been mobilized by ordinary users to contest authoritarian governments, this feels like a very compelling example of distributed power. If we thought also about data-driven advertising, this technology that I talked about in the beginning, this is actually highly accessible. You can see from what's on the screen there how easy it is to create an ad yourself on Facebook. The only barrier to it is having a credit card. There's more than 7 million advertisers on Facebook. There's more than 4 million on Google. So this is a really highly distributed set of powers that are associated with these capabilities. But here's the rub. The wide distribution of power is what produces many of the problematic consequences that we associate with social media. So just to talk about a couple of those. Lookalike audiences, which is the technology that enables you to find new customers who, in terms of their data, resemble your existing customers. That is meant to be used for people to market trainers or insurance or plastic-free sponges. But of course, as we know, it also gets used by political parties, and it's using lookalike audiences that's enabled the AfD in Germany to become one of the most followed political parties in Europe. And of course, we've also seen the awful case of the Rohingya ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, where the one-to-many and encrypted messaging features that Facebook and other tech companies provide have been instrumentalized to coordinate a genocide. So I guess for me, what that implies is that if digital power is distributed, the thing that we need to do if we want to address its negative consequences is focus more on how access to it is controlled and less on the business models of the companies that make it available. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sam. It's a very, very good overview of the book. I mean, one of the things that struck me really when I was reading it was the early comparison you make, or you're looking at the analogy of data being oil, but actually you talk about it not being oil, but actually manure, more of a sort of mundane byproduct of life that we need to process to make it actually useful to help us grow things. I wanted to, throw this over to Ken, what he thinks about that analogy, because obviously The Economist famously had a cover talking about data being the new oil. So are those analogies opposite of one another, or do they kind of fit together in a way, do you think?
Where to begin? Thank you very much, Brian. A great beginning question to start me off, and also thank you, Sam, for first writing the book, but secondly for presenting it to us. Before I answer your question in a way that I think that you and the attendees would not expect, let me first say that I have a disclosure and an apology. Typically, I'm trotted out as a person who respects data and has some sort of forthright views on it. And it's usually there against the people who are sort of the naysayers of data. And my job is to sort of promote data and to sort of explain why there's all these value to it and to bring a clash. And I regret to inform you that actually I really enjoyed Sam's book, and I felt that there was so much similar in terms of how we saw the world that sadly you're not going to get the clash and the sparks that you would like to make a really interesting afternoon session. But be that as it may, let me bring a little spark in, which is to say that The Economist is a broad church, and we have lots of different views, and we sort of wrestle it out. Sam did quote Will.i.am, who wrote an op-ed piece, an opinion piece in The Economist, which I commissioned and edited. So I felt a great parentage to the points that he was making. At the same time, I wrote a book called Big Data a decade ago, and we never used the term data is the new oil because it's so patently absurd and juvenile and unsophisticated as a way of thinking about it. In fact, it was so juvenile that we didn't even feel the need to critique the idea that data is the new oil because the dissimilarities were just so obvious. Sadly, the rest of the world didn't see it. I couldn't actually pull that away from some of the more ambitious people internally, and so we did produce, The Economist, an article that said that data is the new oil. I think for some people it does concentrate their minds, but I was really pleased that Sam in his book debunked that idea. Data is not the new oil, except in the most, again, simplistic of ways. Okay, so with that to set the groundwork, it is a pity that Sam's book needed to be written, because you would think that some form of sensibility would exist if we had this new tool. I don't think that we had a similar sort of debate over mathematics in the great age of Euclid, in which some people said, whoa, are we really going to use math? I mean, for all of these things, sure, we can build architecture and buildings, but we might build weapons too. That could be a real problem. You know, the right angle is going to unleash the catapult, and we should fear and we should resist this temptation. I don't think that that argument existed. But today, when we talk about data, which, if you will, is just simply empirical evidence of the world and how it works, that we've bothered to collect and decided to use and reuse in multiple ways, particularly in ways that we couldn't have imagined at the moment of collection, to extract some forms of new value, we do have this argument. And so, as he rightly points out, surveillance capitalism and Shoshana Zuboff's view of it is taking in one direction. Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, about how algorithms lead to these sort of negative externalities and problems, is another. And Carissa Velez's at Oxford's view of privacy as power is a third sort of critique on the use of data. And Sam's book does a very good job of explaining why data has all these powerful uses that we should celebrate. However, and here's the however, if you take the 3 points that Sam has set forth, which I don't totally disagree with, I'm also not willing to buy into either. And I'll look at each one individually. The first one is that the ad tech system is good and beneficial. I don't think we need to go that far in order to support the idea that data is a social good and very valuable in society. I think that we can have it both ways, to say that data is amazing and we should collect more of it and use it more in society, and look at ad tech and say, this is regrettable. In some instances, as Sam has pointed out very nicely, it leads to great benefits. In other ways, as Sam has pointed out, it does not manipulate us. And I thought he did a brilliant job of explaining why it's not manipulation. But where I think he glossed over too quickly is the risk and the potential for it being misused. And I'll give you 2 small examples. The first one is, we'll call it samizdat literature, which is during the Cold War, if we were in the Warsaw Bloc and like Václav Havel, and we were writing things that were against the government, it was a cordoned off form of literature that was simply usually sort of mimeographed and shared around on the internet. That form of samizdat literature would also exist, and that the person who was watching that could be identified by authorities and sanctioned as a result of it. Okay, so cookie technology would strengthen the hand of an authoritarian, and that's a problem. But that is actually just simply a counting problem. That is, someone has done something and we've been able to identify it. A separate problem is, we'll call it the inference problem, which is, if I can use this technology to catch a terrorist, I can also use this technology to catch a freedom fighter, or someone who wants to preserve liberty. If I have a predictive algorithm to identify the certain traits that might lead someone to do harm in society, or to commit suicide, or whatever I'm looking for, which I think would be a legitimate use, we could still use this to undermine human freedom. So the very technology that we vaunt and the very data that we care so much about, and remember, I'm a guy like Sam who loves data and wants to support it and wants it to go forward in society, I am scared as hell of it being misused by centralized authorities. And I'll say that as general as possible. I co-wrote Big Data, between basically 2009 and 2012. It came out in 2013. So we're talking now a decade ago. This is long before Trump and Xi and the Uyghurs and the Rohingya. And my eyes have, and the Ukraine, my eyes have absolutely opened. And I recognize that I was way too optimistic about the uses of data. And now I am scared out of my wits of how this technology can be abused. And I think that the next iteration is how we think about how we can use it responsibly and find the middle ground. So let's go to the second element, which is, and I'll be quick as well so I can give Rima time to be a respondent as well. I beg your pardon. The second one is that more data is a good thing when it's put into the public domain. There, I agree with it as well. I think that that as a principle, the more data that we have, it leads to better uses of data, and we can exploit the resource better for human advancement. But we do need some sort of controls on it and conditions on it. I don't think that privacy regulation actually does a good job at all of managing that. And the reason why is it focuses on the point of collection, not on the point of use. But the point of collection, therefore, makes it very de minimis. However, the value of the data is getting as much as possible for uses that you don't know at the point of collection, but you only know much later. So we need to really rethink how we're going to regulate data, but we should do so not just with the risk mindset, but with the opportunity mindset. And I'll go beyond the book to say, why don't we have a debate over whether everyone's health records should be made, should be collected, and you're not allowed to opt out if you're going to be belonging to a national health service. I think that there is an intellectual argument to be made that we should proactively accept it, and that if you actually want to not use your data and put it into a controlled commons by certified researchers, that you shouldn't be entitled to National Health Service. That sounds extremist, but I would like to have that debate as an intellectual debate. The third element is that the digital power is distributed and not concentrated. I think it's both. I think that we're in an environment where we're seeing it both. I don't think we have to choose between one or the other. With that, that is the general overview of my response to Sam's very nice presentation and excellent book. And I look forward to hearing from Rima and also participating in the discussion.
Thank you, Ken. Sam, I'm sure there's lots of points you want to respond to, but let's bring Rima into the conversation first. So, Rima, Sam's book, I think, makes a compelling case. Certainly, it made me think about the need to think differently about data. But I was kind of hoping you might be able to shed some light on, what people really think about the way data is collected and used and shared, and how we can kind of challenge or change that mindset.
Yeah, I mean, the angle that I think is really interesting in relation to Sam, but also going back to the kind of the person who seems to have kicked this conversation off that's not in the room is Shoshana Zuboff. So this dimension of what is happening in the relationship between platform organizations and people is super interesting, and I'm interested in it. So the arguments that Zuboff effectively relate to disempowerment, so a resignation, a kind of power dynamic between platforms and people, where people feel they have to be on these platforms and the relationship is somewhat more extractive. And I think collectively we're all interested in a different model. Sam suggesting that relationship isn't the case, but I think there's an immediate reaction that I have, which is that Zuboff's book was very much of its time. So she published it in the context of Cambridge Analytica, which provoked all sorts of questions about the role of Cambridge Analytica, but also Facebook in terms of its relationship with its users and the role of ad tech in doing that. So I just wanted to sort of set that scene before I slightly sadly bring up my slides, because I think that really helps us think through why is this interesting and why is good data engagement interesting and important. in terms of that question, it's just useful, I think, sometimes to just take a bit of a step back and have a look at what we know already about how people actually feel. And what I think is quite interesting here is that people don't necessarily feel that badly about data when we look at the information that's being generated. So this is an Ipsos survey that was commissioned late last year. There's a huge difference in terms of how people feel across different countries and regions, but actually, a number of people do feel that AI and data-driven technology has the potential to have more benefits than drawbacks. And this is a really strong theme internationally, particularly in emerging countries. When we're looking at countries like the UK, Canada, and US, that dynamic has shifted. And it will be really interesting to think about the role that events like Cambridge Analytica or the Ofqual algorithm or the conversation about GDPR, which I think was alluded to, health data sharing, played in impacting the way people feel about data-driven technologies and services. But the other thing that's really interesting is people may have concerns, they may be quite critical, but also they may still be quite positive and optimistic about the role of those technologies. Again, those two things are not necessarily, they may seem like they're in tension with each other, but they're not always necessarily the case. Or another way of thinking about this is that they may have concerns about the future of technology. They may feel it's uncertain, it's ambiguous, that they don't feel like they know a huge amount about it, but recognise its role, its value, its potential, and subject to certain conditions and safeguards, feel very confident about moving forward with it. So you've got this really interesting dynamic, which is the relationship between people as consumers and people as citizens, that's worth unpacking. This is sort of thinking about the pandemic's impact. So just thinking about how people have reflected that sort of slight tension between digital resignation and optimism and vision for technology in the way that they've acted in the pandemic. You can look at that in terms of the behaviour. So people have been quite quick to embrace and engage with technologies and navigate the new world. But at the same time, there's been some challenges around things like missing data, so inequitable levels of engagement with technology. Not everyone has adopted or accelerated use of technologies at the same rate, and also differential levels of trust and confidence in the use of data. But the kind of core point really that I wanted to make in this response to Sam and also Gilbert is around engagement. So how do we get to a place where good data is possible? And the rather sort of basic point here is that usually when we're talking about good data, we're talking about good data that's generated by people. Largely, data comes from a relationship between people and their interaction with a place or a product or service, or so there's that dynamic. Data itself relates to people, and so that means that in general, unless we're going to go back to sort of slightly opaque, disempowered notion where people are resigned to sharing all this information about them without really knowing much about it, and thus kicking off Cambridge Analytica style moments, we need to be in a place where people feel confident sharing their data. And when they feel, and also to do that equally, so this is not easy, but this feedback loop tries to illustrate how to get to that place. When they feel confident with that, so they're doing it with agency, it will improve inequality. So, there's slight challenges around missing data, inequitable access to data, etc. Enabling data for public good it's really important to get to the place where you have data empowerment rather than data resignation. And that will in turn improve the quality of decision making informed by the data, which will then improve public confidence and trust in it. So that's a really important point, I think, to make, which is less about whose narrative or analysis is correct, but more about how do we get to the place where we can have this optimistic vision that Sam's talking about. So why do people think what they think about data? We have quite a lot of experience deliberating about data, working on location data ethics with the Geospatial Commission. That was the project I led at the Ada Lovelace Institute. At the moment, we're thinking about the future of flight technologies in the next 10 to 15 years, things like drones, air taxi. What should the public's vision for that look like? And then also thinking about questions such as the use of court record data. So who should have access to court record data in order to think about alleviating pressures on the court system? And these all touch on these points which Sam's talking about, the data for the public good dimension. There is a way that we can enable that. And the way we do that, the way we engage people in conversation about that is through public deliberation, to create these mini publics that enable people to understand the structures, what's happening here with the technologies, and seeking to understand the conditionality question. So what condition do people want to place on some of these technologies? What vision do they have for the future? And we're doing it in quite an interesting way with the future of flight example, which is to create visionary stimulus futures material and using horizon scanning methodologies to do that. So that's really what I do, and how this links to this cross-cutting theme. I just wanted to make some reflections specifically about online targeting. So we ran an online targeting dialogue that involved 147 participants in 2020 with 2 full days deliberation. And the key point here is that actually online targeting, people felt that online targeting could be valuable, that they thought it was a useful approach, but just to reinforce that point, they felt that there was room for improvement. So they definitely felt that there were concerns about vulnerabilities, concerns about autonomy, that they didn't really know what was happening, stuff happening behind the scenes, and expressed concerns about inappropriate content. So these concerns went beyond this kind of notion of them being surveilled, and more about the structural dimension of the impact that the online targeting is likely to have on people, and did want to see clearer regulation in this respect. But I do think that's important to end with the note that in terms of online targeting itself, they also recognised that there was scope and potential for value in this area, and actually moving beyond our tech. Thinking about that in the context of the pandemic, that in some instances we have seen targeted messages and advertisements coming from government, coming from organisations, and thinking about how we communicate with people through some of these platforms. So I mean, that's a really quick rapid fire overview of my reaction to some of the things that have been presented in Sam's book, but also by Shoshana Zuboff. And the cross-cutting question is, how do we enable good data engagement and empowerment so that we can have good data?
Excellent, Rima. Thank you very much. So I'm going to invite the audience to either put some questions in the chat or raise their hands if they would like to speak to the panel direct. But while people gather their thoughts, Sam, were there any particular points you wanted to respond to from what Ken and Rima have just discussed?
Yes, I mean, lots of things, but let me try and be succinct. So probably the most important thing touches on something both Ken and Rima brought into focus, which is it's kind of to do with the role of the state in all this. So actually, I'm in complete agreement with Ken that we should be more concerned about the existence of data sets and of targeting capabilities and of algorithms when those are combined with the coercive power of the state. Most of us probably get the benefit of living in a context where we're not at significant risk of harm from that happening. There are many, many, many more people around the world who do not have that benefit. So I'm very sympathetic to this perspective. Where that links to some of the data that Rima shared was, I thought it was so interesting, that variance in how people feel about these issues of data and of targeting by country. And I immediately wanted to do a comparison of those sort of approval ratings against trust in government, because my suspicion would be where trust in government, trust in the state is high, people feel a lot more comfortable about data being used, and vice versa. So then just to try and shape that into a like what we might do about all of this. I'm also sort of instinctively sympathetic to Ken's suggestion that we try and get past this idea that everybody is going to make an informed consent decision for their data to be shared. I think we have to find other ways of building legitimacy for data sharing. I should probably also give a plug at this point to Jenny Tennyson and her work on exactly these type of topics, how we build different models for data governance that are more collective in nature. I believe she's going to be speaking at a forthcoming RSS conference, so I hope people will get to hear more about that from her then. But perhaps we could have a situation in which we use the types of deliberative approaches that Rima describes so eloquently to build the legitimacy for collective data sharing that is not reliant on individual consent. Maybe that's the thing that gives us the best of both worlds.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, we've had a question in the chat from Tom. Tom, if you want to read it out yourself, you're welcome to, or I'm happy to. Okay, I'll take it then. So Tom says some potential comes from combining data to calibrate, as in the example of news debiasing for public health surveillance, that requires understanding very different domains, and public data resources can add value to privately held resources. So this is really hard and easy to get wrong in a technical sense, never mind privacy. So how realistic is the prospect of benefits to society as opposed to, for example, tech giants who have the skills, etc.? And if anyone on the panel would like to take that, you're welcome to. But I guess it's directed mostly for you, Sam. Thoughts on that? Go ahead.
I don't mind coming in, which is around, I think there is a challenge, which is around data linkage when you're looking at such different sources, data that's being collected for really different purposes, data that's being redeployed. But I do think it's possible to do it well. I mean, when we look at pandemic responses, particularly in the UK, you saw things like mobility data being generated and used and then redeployed to understand and respond to the pandemic. I think there's an important conversation to be had about data standards. So, when is data good enough for a particular purpose? And I think we've only really just begun to scratch the surface of that conversation. How do we make sure that we have, if we're going to be redeploying, reusing, linking data, how do we make sure we're sense checking that it's giving us the information we need and it's not actually less than fit for purpose? And it would be really interesting to pursue that angle, and particularly for public purposes as well. So that's quite important. So that a lot of the data that is held by private sector companies may be generated for completely different reasons, and then it could be useful for public good and public benefit, but probably needs some thinking about the parameters within which it's useful.
So I completely agree with what Rima just said. I'll just add a couple of things. So one, I think, is that it really highlights also the benefits of interdisciplinarity. And by that, I both mean in an academic context, where obviously the history of academic culture is not really to collaborate very effectively across disciplines. Exactly as the question implies, the existence of these very disparate data sources and the opportunity in bringing them together requires people to get better at interdisciplinary working. We could maybe also extend that to working across boundaries between public and private sectors more effectively. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, which I think is really important, is that everybody retains some healthy skepticism about data sets and about the insights that are generated from linking them together. Because I think one of these, a sort of unfortunate byproduct of some of the things that have been said about surveillance capitalism theory and about the predictive power of the data analytics that big tech companies do is people probably now overestimate what is actually possible, and they're not sort of skeptical and critical enough about some of the claims that are made about what can be done with data. So I think it's important for people who are going to work with these data sets to sort of temper their enthusiasm for the potential, which is obviously a thing that I share, with some realism about what can be achieved.
Okay, we have a question from Sheila Bird. Sheila, would you like to address the panel directly?
Thank you. Just following on that last point, I remember when we first started analysing the UK transplant register for outcome following kidney transplantation, and we noticed that there was a very high risk of graft failure associated with having a DR type. Didn't matter which type it was, just the fact that you had a DR type was indicative that your first graft of graft failure. And of course, the first graft is actually the clue, because DR typing at the time was very rare. So the people who got it were those who'd had a failure of their first transplant. And so ascertainment bias. And no biostatistician would design a register like that, but many people who hold data say these are the data for current use. And that means loads of fields are overwritten. So that's a beware, big time. So in biostatistics, by and large, we deal with design data, which is why we get good results. But the point that I was raising really was a general one, that I think that medical research ethics committees and ethics committees more generally need to be much sharper about how they read and look at patient information sheets, particularly when these have links to outside databases that can be held by people other than the research team and changed by those others without reference to the research team, and hence without reference to the health research, the research ethics committee. And this has happened to a great extent during COVID, and not least reference to government data sites. And also there's been an interplay between asking the citizen to do X, and somewhere buried in the patient information, by law we have to do Y, or not X, or whatever. And again, research ethics committees do not consider it part of their role to check these legalities. Now, I wrote an article in Significance where I was about 1 in a million who did actually check the by law and asked to see exactly what the law said. And the law put an onus on the diagnostic laboratory to reveal personal identifying information that it held. However, by design, the diagnostic laboratory did not hold any personal identifying information about the research participants, and therefore the law did not apply. But you need to be a biostatistician who knows about defending the rights of your research participants to be sufficiently nerdy to follow all that up. And it's not a unique example I have sadly since discovered. So I think...
Sorry, Karen. Sorry, Sheila.
So I think we need a new version of research ethics committees in terms of dealing where linkage is envisaged, particularly, and where force of law. I mean, again, the discussion has been the trustworthiness of a government department or so on. And in this country, there's a healthy skepticism. In other countries, that might not be the case. So I think it's an exciting place that we're at, and we can move forward but we need to move forward thoughtfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. I mean, when you brought up the example that you wrote about insignificance, it did make me think actually about, how we get people to engage more with data, whether it's privacy policies or data sharing proposals from organizations, to have that kind of conversation where, we put some of the concerns to bed that, Rima highlighted in the presentation, and, that Ken raised about because Ken won't be alone in being worried about the misuse of technology by centralized authorities and things like that. So obviously, Rima, you talked about the deliberative approach, but I wonder how do we start having this conversation, say for sending everybody a copy of Sam's book in the post, which would probably be quite good for you, Sam.
Yeah, I think deliberative public engagement is a really great way of doing it, but also this point about coming back to this point about research ethics committees and what they're looking at and the types of impact that they're looking at, because so often the conversation becomes really narrow to the one about privacy and surveillance. And one of the things that we discover through the deliberative work that we're doing is that the questions, the risks, the concerns that people flag are much broader than just privacy. And they tend to sort of touch on some of those themes around vulnerability, social impact, upstream, downstream impact, who's got the power here, those kinds of questions. So finding different ways of embedding that is really useful. But I did, when I was at the Ada Lovelace Institute, I wrote a whole report that was about 75 pages long on all the different mechanisms for participatory engagement in data stewardship. So sort of running through 70 pages here. I mean, I'll put a link to it in the chat, but I think there's a really interesting range of approaches that you can use at different stages in the data cycle that try to do different things to ensure that ultimately the technology is not so off track or so misaligned that it's going to undermine confidence and trust.
I would talk about the value of leadership, of political leadership. In fact, if the country brings a nation to war, the prime minister or the head of state has to speak to people and justify and explain it. Often we need that same form of leadership, but not for such dramatic things, for other social issues that we have. Eisenhower desegregating the schools, for example, just to name one. For a defense matter, the public addresses from the Oval Office in the 1980s with Reagan and Star Wars, as the missile defense system was known. But it's interesting that when we had care.gov about a decade ago flare up, which was the system whereby the NHS wanted to take their data and be able to license it to commercial vendors for different purposes, both researchers as well as for commercial purposes, there was no one in the government who was the quote-unquote spokesperson for that, who's willing to explain and sort of use it as a teachable moment to educate people of why this was actually a beneficial thing for society. Even for private drug companies to learn about conditions, to make better drugs, to prevent diseases. Everyone just went quiet. They put their heads in the sand. So it's interesting that during the track and trace, I'll call it debacle, an app that was created eventually it was not a track and trace system, but it was an exposure notification system. It was done mostly by the private sector, Apple and Google, and not by the different countries that would want to use the data in a viable way. Again, there was no leadership there. There was no one to explain what the value of the data would be. And that was a lost opportunity to explain what we want to do. In fact, it was just the opposite. If you recall, there was a question of how long the data was going to be held for. The answer from the government was, we're not telling you. I'm not making this up. Eventually, after there was enough of a public outcry, there was a lot of public outcries in March to May 2020. Everyone was very nervous. But eventually they said it was for 20 years. But they couldn't justify why it was for so long. So it looked like the government had no idea what it was doing. So the government didn't even have the trust of the people. It didn't even have the competence and display the competence that it could actually manage data in a reasonable way. So you can appreciate why the public might be really wary of giving that power to government. But I think that's a real failing of leadership, of political leadership.
Sam, I wonder if I could, because we're running out of time, if I could bring you in to just comment on that sort of, I guess, failure of leadership and on the need for leadership in this area, because it's not just trust in government that's an issue. I think trust in the organizations like Facebook is probably quite low. People probably doubt the motive. So, you've got the people arguing for the benefits of these technologies, of this data. At the same time, people be saying, well, that's because you stand to gain from more than I do from it. So how do we get around that? I guess that's the real challenge.
So this is quite a tough question to end with, and with a short amount of time to respond. I mean, probably I have a somewhat unpopular view in that I welcome developments like the creation of the Oversight Board, which is the independent body which can essentially overturn moderation decisions that Meta makes. I suspect that those type of bodies are going to be necessary if we're going to get through this impasse, which, exactly as you say, Brian, is based on the fact that even if someone who ought to be very credible in this space, like Nick Clegg, goes and takes a job as Vice President of Public Policy in Facebook, in practice, it feels like there's a barrier to people trusting what he has to say. And I think the general opinion seems to be that the commercial imperatives of the company will prevail over the sort of social and public imperatives that we might prefer to see. So I guess that's just one small piece of evidence to support the idea that we are going to need different sorts of independent bodies that can understand the technologies and the issues at stake in the way that people who work inside the tech sector do, but are also clearly impartial and not directly likely to benefit from the recommendations that they make.
Thank you, Sam. Well, I'm afraid that we are out of time. I think I've got a list of about 5 questions I could ask you that I think would probably prompt a discussion for another hour or so, because it is a really thought-provoking book, as I said at the start, and I encourage you to read it if you haven't done already. So thank you very much, Sam, for coming along, to Ken and Rima for being our discussants today. I'd like to also thank Paul Hewson and Thomas King from the Data Ethics and Governance section for arranging this meeting, and to Luther Martinez and the team, the events team of the Royal Statistical Society for the technical support. And thank you all to you for joining us today and for taking part. And hope to see you at another one of these events soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.